So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think this is going to be one of our most interesting sessions that we have done so far. I'm really excited to introduce you to Sharilyn Amy, and I settle in because this is a really long resume she has here. So she's done so many interesting things. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her before we dive in. She's the developer, co-owner, and operator of an award-winning eco-hotel located on the beach in the heart of a UNESCO World Heritage Site and biosphere reserve in Patagonia. She spent the first years of her career working in communications for the oil and gas sector before transitioning to the Red Cross, where she managed disaster response communications, publicity, and government relations strategies around the globe. She then founded the Go-To Group, a strategic planning, research, and facilitation consultancy. And among other leading and learning edge offers, her team specialized in community economic development, social enterprise, and mergers and acquisitions in the social services, charity, education, and NGO sectors. In 2012, she took a leave of absence from work to spend some time in Argentina, and she completely fell in love with the culture and the challenges of doing business and making a difference within that complex society. After supporting the development of a community economic development tourism project in the mountains of Patagonia, she joined her Argentine business partner to develop their socially and environmentally responsible luxury accommodation. And most recently, she's established another startup called Element Patagonia to help rural and traditional Argentine artisans reach broader markets and create more sustainable livelihoods. And as if that weren't enough, she's also the winner of the Canadian Women of Inspiration Humanitarian Award, the Mount Royal University Alumni Career Achievement Award, and the Royal Roads University Dean Award. She often speaks to groups who are interested in socially responsible and inclusive economies, women in leadership, anti-corruption, and sustainability. And just, she also coaches young entrepreneurs, just in her spare time. So welcome, Sharilyn.
That's a very generous introduction. Thank you very much. I'm tired now and I'm going to go lay down.
I know, I have to say, when I read this, I thought, what have I been doing with my life all this time? Oh. So that's a really, interesting and impressive resume. And I'm sure that's probably only just the highlights. But if we can dive right in, maybe you could tell us a bit about how all of that has sort of shaped your perspective on travel.
Oh, wow. That's a big question. First, thank you very much. That was very kind of you. I think when I was working for Red Cross in those early days in my career, I was in my 20s, and I was working in disaster response in disasters in different locations in the world. And I really was impacted by the vulnerability that we have in the differences in our communities, and how when we can focus on building sustainable livelihoods within those communities, we can help people elevate their level of resiliency when it comes to things like disaster. So there's many, many, many stories of that work. Some of them are far too heavy for the telling right now, but one of the key memories I have of that time is when I was working in China in 1998. I don't know if y'all remember, but there was an enormous flooding that year of the Yangtze River, and there was over 100 million people affected by that flooding. And one day we were going out on an assessment in a boat where the Yangtze had overflown its borders, and it was such an enormous flooding that as far as you could see, looking all around you to the horizon, you couldn't see anything except for the occasional top of a electrical pole or the tiny top of a hill. And so we were out seeking folks that were stranded, and we came across a slight part of high ground, and on that little island of land, there was a bunch of women and children, and they had managed to salvage some tarps, and they had been there for many, many days without any support underneath the tarps in 40-degree heat and 100% humidity. So we landed on that little tract of land to do an assessment and figure out how many people we were dealing with, and to determine the coordinates of where they were so that we could get aid to them. And it was such a tragic scene of despair, and it hit me just incredibly hard, because we were interviewing people to see how many people in their family were missing, and how long they had been there. And we had elderly people who were, caring for their young children because the mothers or fathers had disappeared in the flood because it had happened rapidly. And just I still hear the despair in their voices. And I can remember in that moment just being hit with this overwhelming feeling of how on earth could this be happening to people, and why is this happening to them and not to me? And it was just this clarity of mind that it just, for luck of where my soul dropped down to the earth in Canada. I'm Canadian, and the privilege that we have in our environment where we've been born, that was the only difference. Just as easily my soul could have dropped down to the earth there in the farming fields of China. And at that moment, I just thought, that's it. I need to do something with the privilege of my birth, where I was born. And that kind of defined for me the path ahead. And then over the years of working internationally and also across Canada in community economic development, it became more refined and more refined to this wanting to help folks build sustainable livelihoods, and so that they can have some stability in their economic household. And what we see when we see families with more economic stability, we see them being able to provide better opportunities for their children. And so that's kind of how that experience now affects the way I travel and the decisions I make when I travel. And that's what's led me into this career that I have now.
Oh, it's very interesting. When I was reading a bit about you before to prepare for tonight, I was thinking about the fact that, over the course of my life, I've participated in a lot of social justice initiatives, both through my work, because I spent about 20 years with a social work organization, and also in my personal life. But when I was reading about you, I felt quite remiss in not placing greater emphasis on this in my travels. So, and it's quite one thing to identify an issue and understand how to help within your own culture, but quite another to presume to do so elsewhere in a different context. And so I wonder if you could tell us a bit about where we should start, where travelers should start who want to make a contribution in a community and culture they're unfamiliar with, and in which we're probably only spending a very short time.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. First off, thank you for working in social work. I think I've worked with lots of social workers in my life, and I don't think that there is a harder job than trying to make change within that system and to make a difference for people's lives. So thank you for that. And it's completely justifiable what you're talking to, because when we think about traveling or on vacation, what we're trying to do really is escape from our responsibilities and the things that are heavy in our backpack, and the role we feel that we need to play in our lives. And so oftentimes what we want to be doing is to leave those heavier issues behind and go to the resort and sit on the beach and drink margaritas. And there's absolutely lots of space for that in regenerative and sustainable tourism as well. What would make the difference would be, rather than buying the cheapest package, we tend to be quite motivated in travel around travel deals, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what's happening now, both from the supply side of the situation and the demand side, is that people are putting a bit more emphasis on other values than just make the best deal as far as making the decisions where they're going to stay. So for me, one of the most important that's the most important decision we can make, is where we're going to spend our money. Right now, much of what's on offer in the tourism industry is extractive, and that's a pretty heady word, but what it means is that, you know, you go to a big resort, the owners at that resort happen to be investors in other countries, and so the money that you're spending there, the majority of it leaves the country, leaves the community that you're visiting. In fact, recent research out of the World Travel Organization talked about that being a ratio of like $5 staying for every $100 you spend. So that's not a sustainable model, and it doesn't give respect or credit to the environments that we're visiting. And so one of the most important things we can do when we're traveling sustainably is to consider where we're staying, and to make the decision to put the time and research in required to choose a more sustainable offer. Me, when I travel, I love to ask the questions and ensure that I'm staying with first off, a sustainable or ecologically developed hotel, that, or Airbnb, or whatever your choice might be, that's owned locally, or that has really great policies around their supply chain. Maybe perhaps they're buying from local organic community gardens or things like that. And that takes a commitment of time. And it takes that time as a resource for you too. So it really depends on what your values are around where you're spending the money. But on the flip side of that, perhaps you already have your 1 week on Mexico booked to lay on the beach and drink margaritas, which is fantastic as well. And one of the things I do in environments like that, because I do travel and visit locations like this as well, is just make a complete commitment to be 100% present and asking questions of the people who are interacting with me, so that I can learn about what's really happening in their lives, whether it be the tour guide that I'm going out with on a bike ride that day, or the gal that cleans my room. Just being 100% present and curious. I think what sustainable and regenerative tourism is asking of us as consumers is just to really open our minds and be super curious about what life is like really for the people in the communities in which we're visiting. And in being this way with folks, being super curious about why do they live there? Where were they born? Do they have children? What do they do in their spare time? What's hard about their job? And then sharing with, from my perspective too, my stories, making those human connections I've found have done nothing but really enriched the experience that I've had when traveling. And it also led me down pathways to experiences that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had those really sincere human connections with the people that I'm interacting with. So to make those choices, you can be research oriented and focused on spending your money well. And those I think you should 100% do that all the time, all the way to how we interact with the person who's carrying our luggage or helping us into our room, etc. Every single one of those touch points is a way that we can make a difference. That is not only a difference to the people that we're interacting with, it's a difference for us as well. It enriches our lives. And when you're working with organizations that are doing regenerative travel, which is, you know, actively trying to improve our destinations, what you'll find, and the research proves it, is that when you're helping, you gain more, actually. You know, you get a boost in your happiness, you get a boost in your self-esteem. It gives you a certain value to your holiday, your vacation, that you wouldn't have found otherwise. So I think there's lots of value to shift our mindset around, I'm on this vacation to escape, to I'm on this vacation to live, to bring richness into my life. And these are a variety of different ways you can do so.
But, you know, I was thinking as you were explaining that these are great, really great suggestions. And I was thinking that some of those things that you mentioned are things that we find are actually easier to do as solo travelers, because we're less engaged with the people we came with and more engaged with the people we're meeting along the way.
Totally agree with you. One of my favorite things I did was in Vancouver, and I was there for business back when I was living in Canada. And I didn't have any plans for dinner. So instead I decided to pick a street where there was a lot of fancy restaurants. And I decided that I would go into each one of those restaurants and have whatever appetizer the bartender decided to suggest that was the best of his or her idea for their appetizers. And I actually ate at several different restaurants that day. And I sat at the bar and talked with the bartender. That experience happened over 15 years ago, and I still remember those conversations. And it's the benefit of being alone that puts you in a position of if you're open, puts you in a position to have those conversations with others. Plus, I don't know about you, but when I travel solo, I also like to have certain things organized for myself by way of tours or hikes. Or, for example, when I first arrived in Argentina, I crossed the Andes on horseback solo. I had a guide with me and another fellow who dragged the poor mule with all of our stuff for 7 nights in the wilderness, sleeping under the stars. And I didn't speak very much Spanish at the time, so communication was limited. So we sang songs instead and communicated a lot with our hands. And this was actually the moment where I kind of clued into the impact that tourism could have, because as we were traveling through the Andes Mountains all the way to the border with Chile and back, we were buying food and sharing meals with the subsistence goat farmers that live in the region. And every time we had a touch point like that, there was an economic benefit to the families that were otherwise living off of subsistence farming in the mountains, bringing their goats to the fields every spring. And that, as somebody who'd worked in humanitarian aid before, community economic development before, that was a tool, tourism was a tool that I had never ever considered, remarkably, but it just wasn't in my sphere. And so when I got back from that trip, that was the first project that I decided to invest some of my time in, mostly to learn. I just was doing it as a volunteer with the people who were starting up this tour, to really understand if there was a way to do it that didn't disrupt the economic environment in which all the families were living, but that were a benefit to them. And it's one of my favorite stories, because one of the families, the fellow who was towing the poor mule, he's a wonderful human being who never had the opportunity to learn to read. He didn't attend school past the grade 3 level for us in Canada. And his children now, his daughter is a teacher in a local town nearby. And his wife and his son and he now work with this business that has grown, and it now does over 21 trips a year through the Andes. And they've built onto their little home. When I stayed with them, I slept on the floor in the secondary room, and now they've got a bunkhouse and they do a meal there. And they live in a community called Los Loicas of 20 other families. So it's a very small village where even the dialect of Spanish is completely different, because they're mountain families that have all grown up together. So when a person comes to Argentina to have an experience like that, they're being embedded in a community where they wouldn't normally have access, and they're providing not only an economic benefit, but their hosts have an opportunity to share their culture in a way that they didn't get a chance to do before. And then all of a sudden, we have travelers who understand what it means to be in these rural, remote, and isolated communities. And that makes me think about Brazil and what's happening with the rainforest there, and how we need to protect the inhabitants of these areas and the cultures, how sacred these things are that we're losing to development. So when you've had that personal experience, you suddenly have a heightened awareness of the reality of all the different ways that we as human beings are living on this earth. And I think it makes you a better citizen, world citizen, which is really what our talk was originally, about.
It reminds me, we had a speaker a few months ago he's from Nova Scotia. And what his area is immersive travel. And he was talking about very similar sorts of things, where you actually are in a community and experiencing that way of life or different traditions and cultures, but you're not you're not just buying an experience, you know, you're living it with people, and it's a very special sort of way to travel, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. Good.
Well, I think that, I mean, that leads us to the conversation around regenerative tourism. And I think that that speaks a bit to what is trying to be achieved in a regenerative model. So this was a concept that was getting quite a bit of traction just before COVID hit, where we, you know, in tourism, I've been talking about ecological, ecotourism, sustainable tourism, and what that means as far as not creating harm in the environments and destinations that we're visiting. And the concept of regenerative tourism is that next step, which is how can we as visitors and travelers leave a place better off than what it was for our being there. And I might be jumping us around a bit in the topic, but that's a little bit about to your other speaker's experience, which is in a regenerative tourism environment, not only would you be perhaps staying at a sustainable hotel such as the one that we've built or many others that are in the world, but that development may then also be integrated into the community. So for example, their resort fee might go to a fund that then helps the children at the local village access education, and their organic gardening that they have set up to help feed their guests might also help with food security in the local villages, that kind of thing. So there's, when we start to get alert and conscious about how far our impact can go as travelers, there's just an endless array of ways that we can benefit the communities where we're living. Today I was reading, to come up with other examples than those that I know personally, I was reading about a group that does, I think they're based in Peru, and they take a percentage of their earnings every year and they put it into a microfinance fund, a zero loan micro lending fund. And that fund is available to other locations in their country that don't benefit from tourism. So it's a way of keeping not only the impact of tourism benefiting the community, but making sure that it has a roll-on effect to benefit their greater society. And I thought that was such an inspiring idea. I'm taking it back to my leadership team tomorrow. They don't know what's coming at them because I love that concept. And how do you feel as a traveler knowing that you've participated in that? I mean, it just entirely changes the conversation, because when you go home from that kind of experience where you've, maybe we do at our location with groups, we do beach cleaning. When you come home and talk about not only what you've experienced in this amazing destination, but how you made it better, you know, suddenly you've got a story that has more life and that starts to impact your local community when you return home. All of a sudden you're alert to other ways that you can be participating in your society for the benefit of others.
That's great. It occurs to me that I didn't mention to people, in case there's anyone joining us for the first time tonight, if you have any questions for Sharilyn, you can just type them into the chat and we'll make sure that they get answered before the hour is up. And the sooner you type them in, the better, because I am so interested in what she has to say that we could just go on for a very long time. And,
so give me a fire. If we were sitting around a fire with some glasses of wine, we'd be here till 2 a.m. It's just so, it's such a rich topic, this, you know.
Let's take a little bit of a step back for a second. And what led you to Argentina? How did you get there?
Well, that's a loaded question. No, I had worked all those years internationally, and then my children were born. And so the role that I was playing in disaster response, there wasn't a family placement. So I had just focused on working within Canada, and I went back and did my MBA. I wanted to figure out a way to help find, you know, sustainable solutions for our social challenges. And that's where I started to work on with a variety of different brilliant people on topics that were kind of that leading edge, looking at doing mergers within the nonprofit sector and helping large community groups tackle issues in a more sustainable way. And that was a good 13 years or so of my life, but I really wanted to get back out to live internationally, and I wanted my children to have that experience. And so my husband at the time had an opportunity to move to Argentina. And so we moved the whole family down, and he about a year and a half or 2 years after that moved on to other locations. The children and I stayed here in Argentina and became permanent residents here, and they finished their schooling here and recently returned to Canada to do their university education. So now I have a wonderful second excuse to go visit my homeland more often than before. So that's what got me to Argentina. And I took the first 6 months off of what had been really, really, really demanding career trajectory, dealing with, those topics that I mentioned before were fascinating, but they were also exceedingly draining. There's no easy issues to resolve in our societies when it comes to those challenges that we're facing around social justice and around the inequality that we see even in our own communities in Canada, let alone globally. So I was at a phase where I really did need to take a step back and to take those 6 months off and regroup. And at the end of that time, opening up this new path to tackle something new by way of tourism as a mechanism for social justice, that was the new kind of light that lit up for me. And in that time in Argentina, I traveled in the 10 years I've been here, I've traveled all over this country. And I keep getting surprised every time, every time I go out to see something new or to see the same thing again. I'm bedazzled anew by all that Argentina has to offer. It is an excellent destination for solo travel. I travel mostly solo here on my own. The highway systems are wonderful. Driving is not difficult here. There's great flights to all of the small locations. And culturally, there's a lot of warmth in communities here and a lot of fascination with foreigners traveling, particularly if you do your best to speak a bit of Spanish. People just, I found nothing but a lot of warmth from the communities I visit. And Argentina, like Canada, is broken up into a variety of provinces. And what I have found is that every province is like its own little universe. They speak Spanish slightly different there. They're known for something. For example, in Cordoba, they're known for their sense of humor. Cordoba is one of our interior provinces, and it has beautiful sierras, and it has a huge budding investment in sustainable living out in Cordoba. There's something for everyone here. If you enjoy hiking, then going down south in Patagonia to El Chatan, which is famous around the world. If you're looking for color and culture, going north to Salta and Jujuy, these are locations that you suddenly feel very much in Latin America there. It's heart-stoppingly beautiful. The colors in the mountainside, the food is entirely different. Versus when you're spending time in Buenos Aires, it feels really quite European, actually. So every point of the map in Argentina has something really distinct to offer.
Okay. Well, that answers that. That was quite an answer.
Sorry.
Such a little question. That's
I'm gonna learn how to edit.
I think you're really whetting my appetite for travel.
Please come to Argentina. We are almost on the same time. This is something that fascinates me. We don't get as many Canadian visitors as I would like to see here. And it surprises me because we're almost the same time zone. I'm just an hour ahead of you folks in the Eastern time zone right now. And so it's far in that, you'll probably stop in Miami and then fly overnight down here. So people say, how long should I come? Should I come for a week or 2 weeks? I say, well, 3 months if you have it. You won't be bored. But at least for 2 weeks. If you're going to come all this way, come at least for 2 weeks, because because I have a lot of there's a lot of expats that live here, so they stay for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and in that time they do a lot of travel, and luckily for us, often they come visit us in Peninsula Valdez, and when they go to their kids at the end of their 2 or 3 years, and they say, okay, you've seen all of Argentina, because it's not possible, where do you want to go again? They'll often come back to Peninsula Valdez, where we have Océano Patagonia, because it's such a remarkable experience to be there as a guest. You had mentioned before that it was a UNESCO World Heritage site, and it's also a biosphere reserve. And sometimes these titles get thrown around a lot, but this place deserves its title. It's a tiny little outcrop of land on with a tiny land bridge, so it's quite separated from the mainland. And it has 2 very protected bays there. And in those bays, 1/3 of the world's southern right whales come every year to mate and give birth to their calves. And they stay there for those really precious first few months when they're at most risk. And not only the southern right whales do that, but the hundreds of thousands of penguins do that every year. The elephant seals, we have the only mainland continent breeding colony of elephant seals in the world. And so people are surprised by that in Argentina. It's not something that they expected. But when they come down to the peninsula, when you go to see the penguins, you are surrounded for as far as your eyes can see by penguins. And if you're there when the babies have come out of their nests, you know, there's pathways you're allowed to walk in particular areas because it's all park managed, right? So reserves, so it's all managed. But as you're walking the pathways, the penguins have the right of way, and it takes you a long time to get through the ocean of penguins and their fluffy little babies everywhere. It's fascinating to be, you know, within touch. You're not allowed to touch them, but to be within touching distance of a completely wild colony of penguins that's been growing year over year. And we see the same thing happening for our guests when they come to see the whales. The southern right whales got that name, right whale, because it was the easiest whale to hunt. It was easy to hunt because it was exceedingly curious. So the whales where we are, the boats of course have to stop at a particular prescribed distance. But if the whales come, the boats are permitted to remain. And the whales almost always come because they're so curious. And they come up to the boat, and you will be at the boat, and the whale will be right there, and she'll turn and look at you. You will be eye to eye to a whale. And if you want to have a, you know, a wake up moment as to who we are on this planet and what our responsibilities are to all of the creation that's here with us, stare eye to eye in a little tiny boat beside a really big whale that's peacefully watching you, because it wakes something in you. Our guests come back off of the boats, and I always say to my staff, now we're in the teachable moment, because they've been touched by something that they didn't expect. And now, between the guides on the boats and us at Océano, how our commitment to the environment, and why we protect the water, and why we made sure to build to LEED standards so that there wouldn't be a heavy carbon footprint, why guests can stay with us and feel better about being in that area because of how we're ecologically sourcing things. And this is the moment where people are prepared to say, okay, wow, what's just happened? What did I just see? Is that normal? What can I do to protect that? I can never be again watching whales in a marine park because I just saw a mother and her baby and what happened when they thought they were separated. One of the reasons I felt for this project, fell in love with this project, because we built the hotel in 2016. But the year before was my first time in Peninsula Valdez. And what I saw there was just a story that the world needed to hear. There's not many places in the world like this area. It's a cradle for a lot of the most important marine species we have. And I think the what sealed the deal was that when I was a child, maybe 12, maybe 14, I had watched a documentary about these orcas that surf hunted. I don't know if you've heard about them or not. They're quite famous globally, and they ride in on the wave to the beach, and they grab sea lion pups, and if an orca had a shoulder, they toss it over its shoulder to their family, and that's how they eat. And then they wait for the next wave to come in so that they can get back out safely. The behavior is called intentional stranding. And when I watched this documentary, I think it was even a National Geographic documentary, it was the only family of orcas in the world that had that behavior. That family of orcas is just down the road from where we built Océano Patagonia. Now we know that there's another pod of whales on the other side of the world, just off of Africa, that has the same behavior. And we also know that the mothers in that family grouping teach their young. So it's not a genetic behavior, it's a learned behavior, which just speaks to the intelligence and the network, the family connections that these creatures have. So, I mean, there's all that and more to learn about the environment, thanks to this remarkable place.
Wow. Now I really want to visit.
Please do.
We have a question from Sheila,
Yeah.
and she's asking for some advice on how you find hotels or groups that are involved in regenerative tourism when you're planning travel.
Oh, this is a great question. And I think, Sheila, it's getting easier and easier now. It certainly was much harder to do in 2019. Then the downturn happened. We all got shut down. No one could work. And so lots of folks in travel and tourism started talking more about these topics and how we can improve. So, for example, I next week am going to visit a friend in Ecuador. And I thought, well, this is great for my talk. I'm going to see what it takes for me to find sustainable projects in my trip to Ecuador. And what I realized is that it takes a commitment of time and it takes some research. But if you're Googling things looking for regenerative tourism Ecuador or sustainable travel Ecuador, things like that, you're going to run into tour operators and other groups. Also, we have like the Adventure Travel Tourism Association, World Travel Organization, all of those sort of parent organizations that help guide travel and tourism are putting a lot of investment in training and time right now to help operators like me move more forward into the direction of sustainable and regenerative tourism. So that information's out there if you're seeking it. And then the other important thing to do, because marketing is marketing, is to ask good questions. So I, like when I'm traveling, I often will contact the operators directly because I want to ask them questions. I want to know how long they've been operating. I want to know how many staff are there. If they're doing tours that are supposedly with First Nations people or culturally oriented, I want to ask good questions around who's involved, how many families are involved, what is it that I get to see, just so I can get an understanding that they're, if they say that they are paying attention to the supply chain, what are they paying attention to? If they're an ecological building like we are, what is it that they've done? When we were deciding to build Océano, we knew that the area we were building in had a power problem, electricity problem, because the infrastructure is kind of falling apart in these small communities that are underdeveloped, and it had a water problem. So that's why we focused our building on having geothermal energy and solar panel and water recycling, things like that. So when you're talking to operators, they should be able to really easily answer any questions that you have around this. And the other thing that I think is important, because this all can be really overwhelming otherwise, is to pick what's important to you. Like what's important to me is sustainable livelihoods. I love supporting entrepreneurs and micro entrepreneurs, particularly small family business and particularly women in business. So when I go to an area, those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. Tracy, you maybe are interested more, I think, in food and wine travel, that kind of thing. So I would be like, okay, I want to have the best paella in Spain. Well, okay, the Best Buy in Spain probably is going to be in that little local village down the road where the grandmother of the fisherman's making it. And what an adventure to do the research, ask the questions, have the conversations to get you to that experience versus, having it at the 5-star restaurant that's owned by somebody who lives offshore. That's kind of the long-winded advice. Sorry.
Okay. I just want to remind people we've only got about 10 minutes left. So if you have any burning questions that you want to ask, just type them into the chat and we'll make sure they get answered. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Element Patagonia and the rural artisans that you work with. This sounds really like a really very interesting project.
Thanks. Thank you for that question. Okay, so when the COVID shutdown happened here, we were not permitted to work for 10 months. So, after I laid in a pool of self-pity for a while, I kind of woke up to the fact that while we had savings and were able to, keep our employees working, paid and okay during that downturn, we had just started opening a little store in our lobby, and we were representing local artisans there. And one of them in particular was a woman's cooperative where they were making handcrafts with the local Patagonian wool. And I had just before the downturn, I bought this beautiful poncho from one of them, and we had been sending groups to their location where they were all working so people could get an experience of what it was like to be in a cooperative environment where a lot of our guests don't have that experience. So all of a sudden I woke up and I thought, geez, what's happening to these folks? Because they are rural and remote and they don't have access to any other market but tourism. And they don't have an employer and they don't have a benefits package. So who's taking care of them? I called a Argentine friend of mine who understands retail and who sells products for fashion outside of the country. So she's used to exporting goods. And I said to her, this is a problem, a challenge globally. How do we get how do we help create more sustainable livelihoods for handcraft works that are culturally significant in rural remote communities? Do you want to tackle this problem with me? And so that's how Element Patagonia was born. It's not an initiative that we're making money on in any way, shape, or form, but it's certainly a beautiful project. And so what we do is travel to rural remote communities in Argentina via word of mouth, via story, and find artisans and their families. And we try to put them front and center. So any one of your listeners can look us up on Instagram, Element Patagonia, and you'll see some of the artists that we've visited, and with their permission, we film and we ask them questions and learn about their families and where they've learned their handcraft. And then we purchase from them. We don't do anything on consignment. We do everything to be sure that the artists are taken care of. So we purchase those items and we help bring them to market here in Buenos Aires, where we sell them for a slight increase so that we can help fund the next group of artists and the travel required to bring their product to market. So that's what Element Patagonia is, and it's in its first couple of years of operation, and it's been a huge gift to me anyways, to be able to have muddy boots again. That's what we call it in the international disaster response or development sector, to have muddy boots to get out into the field again and to really be face to face with the communities where you're trying to make a difference. It's been soul satisfying for me.
Great. Now you've answered this in different ways, I think, as we've gone along, but maybe just to wrap up, if you could tell us or remind us about any suggestions you have for travelers for things to keep in mind to ensure that when they travel, they're doing it in the most sustainable ways and that they're giving back to the communities that they visit.
Right. Well, I think the number one thing to remember is that what we pay for, we're saying we want to see. So think about the world going forward and how you want to see the world working. Where we put our dollars is what we're sustaining. And so that means it takes that the power we have as consumers is reflected. And I think we saw that reflected when COVID was happening. And we were just talking about that, Tracy, just before we went live, that, you know, if you wanted your local baker to still be there after the shutdown, or the local restaurant that you liked, you needed to do something to make sure that you could support them financially. Well, now we have a sensitivity, I think, as in our cultures globally, around how much power we have to make those buying decisions. So that would be just the number one thing, is to recognize that when you are purchasing low cost bulk, that's what you're supporting. When you're purchasing value oriented from families, etc., that's what you're supporting. So it's black and white when it comes to that decision. And then to know that it does take, at this point in time, a little bit more effort. Our tourism mechanism is got a lot of money put into marketing and to selling all the product that we have out there, right? So we've got millions of room nights to sell, and really big companies and organizations that are selling those room nights, and they've got big marketing budgets. So you're going to get hit with that kind of stuff first. So at this point in time, it takes a bit of mining. And if you know how to search for sustainable, ecological, regenerative travel opportunities, you're going to start getting better and better at sorting and sourcing that stuff out. And then the other thing that's happening is that we're seeing a lot of tour groups, apps who have been around for a long time, actually starting to orient their offerings in this direction. Thank goodness. And this is just in the last 6 months, because I'm watching this sector fairly closely, that groups that maybe were doing just regular tours before are now coming forward to say, hey, and we also have this and this and this on offer right now. That's more about the regenerative piece. Or we're making these decisions.
Sharilyn, if you can hear us, you're frozen on our screen.
Wait, but you're on mute now, Sharilyn. She's reappeared.
So
there you are. Okay.
There she is.
I'm just going to wrap up by saying we're also traveling not just to benefit our communities and make a difference and be world citizens, but to skate also. So not to be, there's no perfect solution in this. If you make one good choice, or one choice aligned with your values, sorry, I don't want to sound judgmental, one good choice aligned with the values that you want to see grow on your trip, that's great. You've done a great thing. So it's all about making sure you're getting what you need out of your travel and seeing how you can make that richer for you and the communities that you go to.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really wonderful. And I think we do a survey once a year of our members. And last year's survey, a really large portion of people said that one of the things they wanted to do when they returned to travel was to do so more sustainably. And as you and I were talking before we got started about one of the maybe positive, a bit of the positive fallout of the pandemic has been this recognition of being more thoughtful about our travels. And so it's these things seem to be sort of coming together, and I'm hopeful that things are going to improve as we go along, and that we will continue to remember these lessons that we've learned and to carry them forward.
Yeah, I think so. And I think particularly with the solo traveler that's already, many of the things I talked about today, we're already so skilled at, so this is just really reinforcing the value of those skills for sure.
Well, thank you again. This has really been fabulous. And
thanks, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Okay.